All righty. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's daily Bible reading for January 17th. We are in Isaiah chapter 17 today, which contains a message, a pronouncement against Damascus and also against Israel. And then there's a section at the end concerning really just some summary thoughts that can be found here within the text. So let's read this text together as we are continuing to look into this section of Isaiah, which talks a lot about the failings of various peoples and the punishments that are going to come down upon them because of these failings. We're going to see one particular verse today, especially in verse number 10, that really summarizes the issues for Israel, God's people specifically. So we'll pay attention to that as we read verses 10 and 11. So let's get into the text this morning. Glad you're here. Hope that maybe you still have some snow around. Hopefully it isn't causing too many issues for you, but we're thankful that you're taking the time to read the Bible with us today in Isaiah chapter 17. Here is the text, and let's read it together. Isaiah chapter 17 and verse number 1. A pronouncement concerning Damascus. Look, Damascus is no longer a city. It has become a ruined heap. The cities of Ar are abandoned. They will be places for flocks. They will lie down without fear. The fortress disappears from Ephraim, and a kingdom from Damascus. The remnant of Aram will be like the splendor of the Israelites. And here's a familiar phrase that we've seen as the Lord is giving out these judgments. This is the declaration of the Lord of armies. Verse number 4, this is a judgment now concerning Israel. On that day, the splendor of Jacob will fade, and his healthy body will become emaciated. It will be as if a reaper had gathered grain, his arm harvesting the heads of grain, and as if one had gleaned heads of grain in the Rephaim valley. Only gleanings will be left in Israel, as if an olive tree had been beaten, 2 or 3 olives at the very top of the tree, 4 or 5 on its fruitful branches. Again, this is the declaration of the Lord, the God of Israel. On that day, people will look to their Maker and will turn their eyes to the Holy One of Israel. They will not look to the altars they made with their hands or to the Asherahs and shrines they made with their fingers. On that day, their strong cities will be like the abandoned woods and mountaintops that were abandoned because of the Israelites. There will be desolation. And here we go. Here's the key verse here, I believe. Verse number 10, for you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and you have failed to remember the rock of your strength. Therefore, you will plant beautiful plants and set out cutting from exotic vines. On that day, you will plant, you will help them grow, and in the morning, you will help your seed to sprout. But the harvest will vanish on the day of disease and incurable pain. The roar of many peoples, they roar like the roaring of the seas. The raging of the nations, they rage like the rumble of rushing water. The nations rage like the rumble of a huge torrent. He rebukes them and they flee far away, driven before the wind like chaff on the hills and like tumbleweeds before the gale. In the evening, sudden terror. Before the morning, it is gone. This is the fate of those who plunder us and the lot of those who ravage us. Again, we're seeing 2 specific nations addressed here this morning. Number 1 being Damascus, which is the capital city of Aram, which if we go back to the beginning of the book, if we remember in chapter 7 specifically, there's this plan between Aram and the northern kingdom of Israel to try to stand against the Assyrian nation, and they want Judah to join in, but Judah doesn't want to do so. Well, here is the declaration of the Lord of armies against Aram, that it would be destroyed as well. Israel is not spared here, though a lot of these nations addressed are the nations of the nations of the world outside of Israel and outside of Judah, outside of the people of God. There's still a judgment here against Israel. And the reason for that is because, really, how different are they from the nations right now? How different are they from the world around them? Specifically, what we see in verse number 7 or verse number 8, that there were altars that were made by them. There were Asherahs and shrines that were made by them. And that was what they focused on. And they did that because verse number 10, I believe this right here, these three verses, or I should say 3 lines, are the key issue. They are the root cause of why Israel is being pronounced against here, is because they had forgotten the God of their salvation. They had failed to remember the rock of their strength. They had forgotten God, and it showed in the way they behaved. And it was also going to show in the way that they suffered because of it, because there's this language here of them planting these great plants and looking for a great harvest. And yet, whenever they go to the harvest, there's going to be nothing. It's going to vanish on the day of disease and incurable pain. So here we have even Israel, God's own people, at least people who should have been acting like God's people, behaving in such a way as to incur punishment. And then there's these last few verses here, verses 12 through 14, remind me a lot of Psalm chapter 2. If you remember the opening of Psalm chapter 2, the question is asked by the psalmist: why do the nations rage? Why do they plot a vain thing? Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand. The rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. Let us tear off their chains and throw their ropes off of us. Here, the nations are really raging again. And I think it's very generally speaking of the nations of the world, or the peoples surrounding Israel, that they think that they can do as they want. And yet here is God just showing his absolute power over them as well. His sovereignty over them is absolute as well. And he's going to bring terror against them. And though they thought they could plunder whoever they wished, they were going to be the ones to be plundered. And that is the reading then of Isaiah chapter 17. But again, I just want to focus on verse 10. They had forgotten their God, the God of their salvation. They had failed to remember the rock of their strength. And because of that, they were punished. Because of that, they were incurring this horrible disaster that was going to come upon them. This was their major mistake. And today, I hope that we will remember this mistake that they made and not make it ourselves, that we would remember their failures to remember God, and that we would in turn then remember God in everything that we do. Thanks for tuning in today. Hope that you do have a great rest of your day. Hope you might even be able to enjoy some of the snow outside. But I hope you're staying warm and staying safe. And we hope that you'll tune in again tomorrow for another reading from God's Word. Tomorrow, we will be in Isaiah chapter 18. And don't forget that on Wednesday, we'll be getting into a New Testament reading as well. We'll be picking up in Luke chapter 1 on Wednesday.